Every country in the world is in debt. The United States currently owes more than $38 trillion, the highest level in its history. The European Union has around $14 trillion in debt. Japan is close to $9 trillion. Even oil-rich countries like Saudi Arabia or export giants like Germany and China carry massive amounts of debt. But here is the paradox. If everyone is in debt, who is everyone indebted to? This is a story of financial history where money, power, and history collide. And nothing is as simple as it looks. Debt is not just a burden. It is the architecture of the modern world. Every war, every crisis, every rise and fall sits on top of this invisible scaffolding. And if you follow the chain of creditors long enough, you discover something unsettling. The world is not indebted to a single entity. It is indebted to itself. But that does not mean everyone benefits equally. To understand how we reached a point where the planet is buried under more than $315 trillion in debt, nearly 3 times the size of the global economy, we have to go back to the beginning. Long before credit cards or digital transfers, the idea of national debt was born not on Wall Street, but on the battlefield. In 1694, England was at war with France and running out of gold. The king turned to merchants for help. In exchange for steady interest payments backed by future taxes, they financed the crown. To manage this new arrangement, the Bank of England was created. This was revolutionary. The state could now spend money it did not yet have. In return, lenders received something priceless, a government promise that could be bought and sold. This was the birth of the government bond, the seed of the modern financial system. France copied it. The Netherlands refined it. The newly independent United States adopted it to fund its revolution and later its westward expansion. National debt was no longer a sign of failure, but a measure of credibility. The ability to borrow became the ability to rule. Empires once conquered land to extract gold. Now they issued bonds to extract interest. The battlefield became the balance sheet. Fast forward 3 centuries, and debt has become the world's dominant export. The United States owes $38 trillion. Japan, more than $9 trillion. Global borrowing increases by the equivalent of $1 trillion every 100 days. Every country owes. Every bank lends. Every citizen, through taxes, savings, and pensions, is both a debtor and a creditor. But who exactly holds the other end of the rope? Let's start with the United States because its debt is not just national, it is global. Of that $38 trillion, about half is publicly held, meaning it is owed to investors rather than other parts of the government. Roughly 2/3 of those investors are American banks, pension funds, mutual funds, insurance companies, and the Federal Reserve itself. The remaining 1/3, about $9 trillion, is held by foreign entities. Japan is the largest holder with around $1 trillion, followed by China with about $800 billion. Then come the United Kingdom, Luxembourg, and Belgium. So when people say the U.S. is indebted to China, that is true, but only for about 2% of the total. Most of the debt America owes is owed to America. The Treasury issues bonds. Banks and funds buy them. The Federal Reserve often buys them back, creating new dollars in the process. Americans pay taxes that fund interest on those bonds, and that interest flows into American retirement accounts. It is a circular mirror. The debt is real, but the creditor is largely a reflection of the same system. And this circularity is not uniquely American. It is global. Japan lends to the U.S. through Treasury bonds. The U.S. lends to Europe through the IMF. Europe lends to developing countries through the World Bank. Developing countries, in turn, lend back to advanced economies by parking foreign exchange reserves in Western bonds. It is a planetary game of hot potato, except the potato is made of promises. Every country holds someone else's IOU. Every promise is backed by another promise. It is like a poker table where every player has borrowed chips from the next. And the only rule keeping the game alive is that nobody stands up. But there is a fourth layer, the most powerful of all, the markets themselves. Behind every government bond lies a web of institutions, hedge funds, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and central banks, managing tens of trillions of dollars in assets. They're the true arbiters of credit. They decide which nations can borrow cheaply and which must pay a premium just to survive. When they lose confidence, currencies collapse, governments fall, and entire economies can be restructured overnight. Democracy decides who governs. Markets decide who survives. And the ultimate market maker, the modern high priest of this system, is the central bank. Central banks do not merely manage debt. They manufacture it. Every time the Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank buys government bonds, it creates new money in exchange. The liability on one balance sheet becomes the asset on another. Every dollar in circulation represents a unit of debt somewhere else. There is no such thing as debt-free money. Every coin, every bill, every digital dollar has an invisible IOU engraved on it. For decades, this loop has sustained itself through confidence. As long as investors believe governments will pay interest, even if they never repay the principal, the machine keeps turning. But what happens when confidence wavers? We have seen it before. In Greece in 2010, government debt became unpayable. Bondholders panicked. Yields spiked. The European Central Bank and the IMF stepped in. But the rescue came with austerity, higher taxes, spending cuts, and mass unemployment. For an entire generation, bailout became another word for sacrifice. In Argentina, repeated defaults turned debt into a national curse. In Sri Lanka, fuel shortages and political collapse followed when the government ran out of foreign currency to service its loans. When the system breaks, the creditors suddenly become visible. The IMF, the rating agencies, the anonymous bondholders who hold entire nations by the throat. And yet, even after collapse, the same logic restarts. New loans replace old ones. Old debts are restructured. The machine resets with a new name on the same balance sheet. That is because in the 21st century, debt is not designed to be repaid. It is designed to be rolled over. Governments today do not actually plan to pay off their debt. Not now, not ever. This is not a conspiracy. It is policy. When you or I take out a loan, we are expected to repay the principal. Governments operate differently. They treat debt like a rolling subscription, issuing new bonds to pay off old ones, a process economists call refinancing. Interest becomes the real product, the rent charge for stability. The global economy now depends on that rent, like a shark that must keep swimming to breathe. The global financial system runs on confidence, not repayment. The United States will never clear its $38 trillion debt. It will refinance it forever. Japan has been rolling over its debt for decades, now exceeding 250% of GDP, and yet its government bond yields remain near zero. Investors are not waiting to be repaid. They are waiting to renew the deal. Why? Because government debt is considered the safest collateral in existence. A U.S. Treasury bond is not viewed as a liability, but as an asset, the foundation of global markets. Pension funds hold it. Banks use it as collateral. Central banks treat it as money. The system depends on governments never paying off their debt, because if they did, the world would lose its most trusted financial instrument. Imagine if Washington decided to pay off every last dollar of its debt. Banks and funds around the world would instantly lose their most stable asset. The money supply would shrink, triggering deflation and collapse. Paying off the debt would destroy the very mechanism that keeps the economy functioning. So governments do the opposite. They keep issuing more, not recklessly but rhythmically. Debt becomes the heartbeat of capitalism itself, pulsing through every pension, mortgage, and market on Earth. That is why when politicians talk about balancing the budget or paying down the national debt, they're selling an illusion. The goal is not to eliminate debt. It is to keep it sustainable, serviceable, and desirable enough that the system never stops believing in it. Because once belief fades, the numbers stop matching. Confidence collapses, interest rates spike, and an economy built entirely on rolling promises grinds to a halt. That is the real secret of sovereign debt. The plan was never to pay it back. The plan is to keep the world believing it will. It is a closed loop of trust, and as long as that trust holds, the numbers can stretch indefinitely. But trust is not evenly distributed. When we say we owe it to ourselves, that is only half true. Interest payments do not flow equally through society. They flow upward, from taxpayers and workers to the institutions and investors who hold the debt. In other words, debt is not just a transfer between countries. It is a transfer between classes. That is why global inequality and global indebtedness rise together. The system rewards those who own debt and punishes those who only pay it. If this feels familiar, it is because it is the same story told at a larger scale, from households to nations, from nations to the planet. Creditors are not villains. Debtors are not victims. They are two sides of the same engine. The real question is what happens when the engine runs out of fuel, when new borrowing can no longer keep pace with old promises. That is when the question, who is the creditor, stops being abstract and becomes personal. Because at the top of this global pyramid, there is no single villain to blame. Not China, not Wall Street, not the IMF. It is all of them, and it is us. The modern financial system has turned debt itself into money. Governments issue it, banks multiply it, investors trade it, and citizens depend on it. The line between debtor and creditor has blurred beyond recognition. Debt once meant slavery. Today, it means balance. But if that balance breaks, if trust shatters, the illusion ends, and we remember what debt really is, a promise that cannot be held forever. Join US for more. Subscribe.